Okay, so this is a review of the Dead Girls Detective Agency. Hold it up there so you can see it. Okay. Now, if you are new to my videos, I do split my reviews into two different sections. I have a spoiler version and a non-spoiler version in one. We start with 3 pros and 3 cons about this book that are spoiler-free, and then, oh, sorry about the glare, and then I go into the spoiler section after that, and I do make it very obvious when I'm about to go into the spoiler section, so if you don't want to be spoiled about this, don't worry, I will make that obvious for you. But one thing I am going to give away right off the bat is my star rating for this book. I ended up giving this book 2 stars, and I will absolutely tell you, I should say, why I gave it 2 stars, why it wasn't rated higher, and why it wasn't rated lower. I have the feeling, though I haven't really checked it out on Goodreads, I have done my review there, but I haven't checked out what other people have said about it, but I have the feeling that this book would probably have mixed reviews. Some people will agree with what I'm going to say, some people will hard disagree with what I'm going to say, but let's just get right into it. Once again, this book is called The Dead Girls Detective Agency, and it is by Susie Cox. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 cons of this book that are spoiler-free. And I have a cheat sheet down here, so I'm going to look down at it. Okay, the first thing that I need to talk about, my first con, I'm going to try and keep the glare away as much as possible. I apologise, it's a very nice glossy cover, so, well, it's a contacted cover, I should say, from my library, so I do apologise. The first con I'm going to talk to you about is actor names, singer names, band names, movie names, TV show name dropping. Oh my gosh, it is littered throughout this book. Anytime that the author can describe something, I'm just going to pause because we're hearing loud crickets in the background. It's late at night, but I'm going to shut the door. I forgot to do that. Just a moment. Okay, my apologies for that. I did shut the door when I was doing my first review on Helen Keller's Teacher, but I forgot to shut it this time, so I'm sorry if you heard all the crickets in the background. I'm not camping, I am at home, it's just late at night. Back to my con. Yeah, any time that the author was describing something metaphorical, she seemed to favour jumping right in and referencing anything famous that she could. Really, anything at all. From the character of Jack from Titanic, to Edward and Bella from Twilight, to singers, to actors. So Leonardo DiCaprio is mentioned separate to the reference of Jack. Titanic is referenced separate to the character of Jack and Leonardo DiCaprio. Twilight is mentioned separate to Bella and Edward. Robert Pattinson is referenced separate to Bella, Edward, and that reference, and the Twilight reference. And it's not just those 6, that's not even half of the references to what I call famed. She is using famed metaphors. Now, I don't know if that's a rule, not a rule, if that's a category, but that's what I'm going to call it. When you take a metaphor and rather than explaining it in a general descriptive way, you grab something from pop culture and use that instead. Now, I'm going to give you a spoiler-free idea of what I'm referring to here. Let's just say that there was an unrequited love scene that was going on, and the character's having an internal monologue saying, it felt like that moment with Edward and Bella when they were da-da-da, or if the character came across someone who was pale-skinned, oh, this reminded me so much of Twilight, and da-da-da. So there was just so much of this that went on in this book, and it really annoyed me because, to me personally, I kind of thought that this might be a copyright issue. Clearly the book got published, so clearly either the author hasn't been picked up for copyright or there was no issue, but it was littered throughout the book. It didn't happen once or twice, it happened so many times throughout the book, and that was a massive turn-off for me. Because I felt, even though it's YA, I felt the author could have taken an alternate route with her metaphors and other words she could have used that didn't reference actual actors and characters from pop culture. I just didn't think, personally for me, it was necessary, but that's just my own personal preference. My second con, okay, the word like. I'm sorry to have a bit of a face here, but I am not someone, oh, sorry about the glare again. I am not someone who likes the word like being used several times throughout a sentence when it is not, in my opinion, appropriately being used. So, excuse me, if you were to say, again, excuse me, if you were to say, I like ice cream, great. If you were to say, she likes that boy, great, that's wonderful. But when I hear people, see people, or read about people who are saying, so, like, what are you going to do now? Or, so, like, the other day, I did. And then it turns into a like kind of book. And I did not enjoy that. Like was probably written, in my view, inappropriately about 100 times throughout the book. Massive con for me. I just don't think it was needed. This is a YA novel, and I understand that maybe those characters are like that, but in my view, it took this novel from a YA novel to more of a juvenile, either way, novel. And I just did not appreciate that. Okay, third con, the amount of times we deviated from the premise. I don't want to say from the plot, although on my Goodreads review I did say plot, but the plot is what the plot is, so I mean more to say the premise. The amount of times we deviated from the premise really upset me, because the premise of this book is absolutely amazing, and that's why when I read the blurb, the premise of this book, I reserved it right away at my library, and it came in really quickly, and I was so excited to read it. And I will talk about that in the spoiler version, but this book deviates from the premise, oh my gosh, probably for 50% of the book. That might be overstating it, but even if it is, it's only just a smidgen, because it deviates from the premise a lot. And I did not like that. Now, I'm starting to get used to the fact that YA novels, regardless of its genre, regardless of the massive genre, so let's say that there were minor genres, but also a major genre. Regardless of the major genre, YA books will deviate with something or another. Most of the time, what I'm seeing is with romance, even if it's not a romance genred book, which would be interesting to read a YA romance, just as a sidebar. It'd be really interesting to read a YA romance to see what they deviate from the romance with, but anyway. There seems to be a ton of deviation going on in YA, and I'm just not a fan of it. Again, that's just personal opinion. But this author deviates from the plot so much, and I found a lot of the deviation to be quite boring, I do have to say. And that's why it got a low rating. However, it did not get 0 stars or 1 stars, and here are 3 reasons why it did not receive 0 or 1 star. First pro. With the deviations aside, the plot was amazing. So anytime that we were actually on task and staying focused with what the premise of the book was, it was actually a really interesting read, and I very much enjoyed it. In fact, I DNF'd another book that I won't talk about here, but if you want to see my reading vlog for this week, you can, and I discuss it over there. I DNF'd another book that I really wasn't enjoying reading, and then at the same time, this book came into my library, and I thought I'll replace this book with the one I DNF'd. And was it worth the replacing that one with the other one? Absolutely, because this was a good book. It wasn't a bad book, where the one I DNF'd, it just didn't interest me at all. The premise interested me, but the book itself, the execution, just did not interest me at all. I just didn't like it at all. But this one, it's not to say this book is bad. It's not. 2 stars is still a good rating. It's an I like rather than an, like, right? like. But yes, to add another like, I like this book. I don't love this book. I didn't find it fascinating. I wasn't obsessed with the book, but I did like this book. And the general plot, deviations aside, was really enthralling and a great read. So it just didn't happen often enough, but when it did happen, it was really, really good. Okay, the magic systems. Now, I say this loosely as this is not a magical book. It's, if anything, it's more supernatural. The genre of this book, technically speaking, is a mystery, and the subgenre is supernatural. It's supernatural because it involves ghosts. The magic system, that I use those terms loosely, the magic system, is more of a system of what ghosts can and cannot do in Susie Cox's world of the Dead Girls Detective Agency. And so that system I really loved. One thing that I can say that's not too much of a spoiler is that the protagonist is given a book at really early on in the story. She's given a book by one of the other characters that tells her things that ghosts can and cannot do. And I don't think that's too much of a spoiler because it says as much in the blurb that, you know, the character is killed right away and she's a ghost. So I don't think that's a spoiler. I think if you've seen the blurb, you already know she's dead. She's given a book by one of the other characters, and this book contains pretty much everything that ghosts can do, but the protagonist, unlike me, didn't want a bar of soap to do with the book, which really annoyed me because I just wanted to jump in the book and say, that's fine, you don't want to read the book? Do you mind if I read it while you go off and do whatever you're going to do while you're deviating from the premise of the book? I'll just read this thing. But what we did learn, and I also learned that there's more than one book, this is not a standalone. So, fortunately or unfortunately, it really depends on your own perspective. For me, I don't know. I'm still making up my mind whether I want to read the next one or not. From what we did get about what ghosts can do, I absolutely loved it. There are two types of characters that work with the main character. One is and I'm not saying this in a derogatory way, it's just the most succinct way to describe this character. A goody-goody two-shoes, always sticks by the rules, good character. Then there is another one that's dark and brooding and likes to take risks, and both of those side characters teach the protagonist different things that ghosts can do. I appreciated all of it. The goody-goody, stick to the rules side, and the dark brooding, don't really care about the rules side characters and their explanations, and I loved that. So that I really, really appreciated, and if there is a lot more of that in the second book, I will be much more inclined to read the second book. The third pro is the final climax of this book. Now, in my reading vlog, I kept forgetting the word climax, but that's the word. The final climax of this book. Now, I will tell you that there are, in my opinion, two climaxes that occur. One that is expected, and you get to a point where you're going, okay, we know what this is leading up to. We know that there is going to be a climax that has something to do with this, whatever it is, and that does happen. But then there is another massive climax that happens right at the end that, oh my gosh, it came from completely out of left center, but I absolutely loved this final climax. I thought it was just really amazing, and by the time I finished the end of this book, because it's part of a series, it closes with an enticement to read the second book. So something has happened right at the end of the book that leads you into where you're going to continue from the end of the book with the second book. And that did very much entice me to want to go into the second book, because there are, many, many, many reasons that I want to read it, but there are also many reasons why I don't want to read it. So this wraps up our spoiler-free version of my review of the Dead Girls Detective Agency. When we return, I will be doing the spoiler version. But for those of you who don't want to stick around for that one, I did give this book 2 stars, and I will now ask anyone who doesn't want to be spoiled to click away from this video, maybe go and watch one of my other reviews, or you can watch my reading vlog. So yeah, check those out. And if you don't want to know about spoilers, feel free to leave me comments, questions, anything below about anything I've discussed with the pros and cons. Do you agree? Disagree? Soft disagree? Hard agree? Hard disagree? Let me know in the comments below. But when we return, we are coming back with spoilers. You have been warned. We'll be back in just a moment. Okay. So my spoiler section has two subsections within it. The first one is the plot, where I talk about what this book is about, including spoilers. I'm so sorry, I'm going to put the book down because the glare's really getting to me. I talk about the plot, about what goes on in the book, and then I wrap up my spoiler section with my thoughts of what I've just described. So let's get right into the plot. Basically, this book revolves around the protagonist, whose name is Charlotte, and within the first chapter, she's standing on a platform in the subway of somewhere in New York, and I'm from Australia, so forgive me. Anyway, and she is run over by a train and she dies. This happens right in the first chapter. She ends up in this hotel and she meets these other girls who are, I'm trying to remember their names, oh gosh, Nancy, Lorna, and Tess. And they explain to her, Nancy kind of takes the lead with this one. She's kind of like Detective Nancy. Well, I mean, she keeps being nicknamed Detective Nancy Drew, but anyway, Nancy explains to her that she's dead. Charlotte doesn't want to believe her, but, very quickly she ends up, working out that, no, they're not kidding her and they're not pulling a prank. She actually is dead. And they tell her that she's not in heaven or in hell. She's basically in limbo. And for her to be able to move on to wherever she's meant to go, heaven or hell, she needs to work out who killed her and why. And once she works out who killed her and why, she will receive a key. Within the place that she ended up going to once she died, which is the Hotel Atessa or Atisa, it really depends on how you pronounce it. When I read this. Some portions I just read it, and then other portions I read alongside an audiobook, which I need to mention here because I will be bringing up the audiobook here and there throughout this. But the audiobook calls it the Atisa Hotel. I read it as the Atessa Hotel, so I don't know. But anyway, in the Atessa Hotel, there is a big red door that is locked, and the only way to access this red door is with the key, and you can only get the key by solving your murder of who murdered you and why they murdered you. You solve that, you get the key, you go through the door, and it takes you on to where you're meant to go. So, amazing premise, and this is explained in the first chapter or two, and I thought this is going to be an amazing journey. I can't wait to work out who killed her and why, and then see her go through the door, and all this kind of stuff, and yeah, it's going to be pretty amazing. So, she starts trying to figure out who it could be that killed her, and she goes through a grieving process. She does not go and visit her parents. Now, I need to make a point here that apparently Snapchat have what's called Snap Originals, and they've created a show called The Dead Girls Detective Agency, which aside from the characters having the right names, is so non-canonical. Oh my god, I'm sorry. I saw a little bit of it after I'd finished reading the book. I watched a little bit of it and I thought, okay, no, this doesn't happen, that doesn't happen, that doesn't happen. And the reason I'm bringing it up here is because in the book, the point is made that she's not going to go see her parents because she's so overwhelmed with grief for dying, which is really interesting because generally we think of those who are grieving as the ones who are living. But here we are following the protagonist who has died, and she is grieving over the fact that she died and she's leaving others behind, rather than following a character who has had someone else that's died and they've left them behind. So really interesting perspective there. Anyway, she says she's not going to visit her parents because it's too heartbreaking, it's too early, and she never ends up visiting her parents, which I don't have a problem with. Maybe she will in book 2, who knows? But the time span of this book was probably about a week to a week and a half, the absolute most, so it makes sense that she doesn't go visit them. In the show, she visits them in the first minute, and it's like, no, that's non-canonical, what are you doing? And so many other things that they do, and I'm just like, what? Just, oh my gosh. So, yeah, it just deviated way too much for my liking. Anyway, they try and work out who the killer is, and things happen along the way that I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of. But eventually she meets another resident at the Atessa Hotel, who is the dark brooding character, who I'm starting to realize I love the dark brooding characters, especially when there are, and since, Susie Cox Is that her name? Yes, Susie Cox, sorry. Feels the need to name drop and character drop. I'm going to do the same thing. When you have characters that are so Elle Woods from Legally Blonde upbeat, and I love Legally Blonde. I do, and I can't wait for the third one to come out. It's coming out in May, my birthday month, which is really awesome, but that aside, when you have these characters that are so overly positive, and then you have such a stark contrast with a dark brooding character, I tend to kind of love the fact that there's a dark brooding character and really appreciate them more than the happy, bubbly ones. And these ones that are happy and bubbly are a little too happy and bubbly and sprightly for my liking. So she meets this character. His name is Edison. And Edison doesn't really tell her much about him at all. We certainly don't go and visit his family. Unlike in the show, in the first 5 minutes, we meet Edison's grandma. We don't meet any of Edison's family in the book. But anyway, see, it deviates so much. But anyway, so Edison talks to her, and eventually she's going back and forth between Nancy and Lorna. Tess kind of just does her own thing. If she wants to join in with the girls, she will. Otherwise, she doesn't. But Tess and Lorna are all about being this detective agency, and they have a blackboard or a whiteboard. I think it's a blackboard. A blackboard in the background that they're writing names and motives and all this stuff. It's very much a detective agency, where Edison's kind of on the other side saying, I know that they're saying this, but that's only half the story. What you should know is this. So let me explain that in a little more detail. Nancy is very much, as I said, a goody-goody, non-lawbreaker kind of great, high moral, character. So there is this rule book that she gives Charlotte at the beginning. I spoke about this in my 3 pros and cons, in that Charlotte doesn't read the book, but I want to read it. This book contains everything that ghosts can do. Oh my god, why can't I read this book? Can Susie Cox just release that book? Like with Harry Potter, how J.K. Rowling wrote about Fantastic Beasts and where to find them, but before it became a film, she then released it as a book, so you could actually read the book that was within the book. Susie Cox, please release this book. I want to read it. But anyway, the main character, she doesn't care too much about it, but she's still introduced to things that she can do, such as apparating rather than apparating. Very slight deviance there to that word in Harry Potter. But anyway, apparating is the ability to become corporeal, to be seen by the living, as opposed to being a ghostly figure and not being seen by them. She learns that very quickly, and she learns how to transport herself, and I don't remember what that's called. Porting, yeah. It's called porting in the book. It's called something else horrendous in the show, which I don't remember what it is, but even they even got that wrong. But anyway, so many things wrong in the show. But anyway, so I'm not going to be watching the show anymore. So she learns those things, and Nancy's very much saying, you can't break the rules, and apparently there were people who were there before Nancy, and then when Nancy came along, they told her, these are the rules that you need to stick by, and if you break them, you get in trouble, and da-da-da. Like, there's one really cool rule, which is you get 9 times you get to do, which 9 is a random number, but anyway, there's 9 times where you get to do something, anything that you want to do, and it won't count as rule breaking. But once you've done those 9 things that you just want to do for your own personal gain, then you can't do any more. So that's fine. But then Edison flips the book and says, well, they're only telling you half the story, because here's some things you can do, excuse me, that don't break rules. So he was showing her things about how to shut out the audio of the world, which was really interesting. Like, he clicks his fingers, and then suddenly it's like the protagonist becomes deaf, and she can't hear anything that's going on around her. She can see it, but can't hear it. Oh my god, I want to be able to do that sometimes. I'm sure we all do. And other things that he taught her along the way. Like, for example, rather than just apparating, if she is going to try and scare a confession out of a suspect that she is considering has murdered her, he teaches her how to transform into a massively tall and wide, what would you call them, zombie, and become really scary looking, and that was pretty cool too. So a lot of different things that he taught her. Anyway, let's fast forward to the end. Eventually they find out who well, they go to her funeral, which is a bit weird because she had a boyfriend and then she died. I mean, now I feel like I'm full on talking like a YA, you know? She had a boyfriend and then she died and da da da. But anyway, she had a boyfriend, then she died, but then the boyfriend ended up getting with all these cheerleaders, which really broke her heart. And at her funeral, he kissed a cheerleader, which really pissed her off. But anyway, we'll just skip over all that. Eventually, she finds out who ended up killing her, and it was this library girl. That's what she's tagged as, a library girl. And library girl apparently knew the boyfriend like a couple of years or 5 years or so prior to Charlotte meeting him, and she loved him, and they met at a camp, they danced together, then they never saw each other again. But then he transferred to her school and she thought that she would go out with him, but moments later Charlotte ended up with him, and then she gets heartbroken as librarian girl sees Charlotte making out with him and all these other things, and so she plans a way to kill Charlotte in order to be able to move in on the boyfriend. So we find all this out in the first climax when it is revealed that it absolutely was her. It's revealed in a really good way that I really don't like. The way that Charlotte works it out is so good that I don't even want to reveal it here. Like, read the book because it's done really well. But anyway, I will say that right before it is confirmed that it is Library Girl, the chapter right before that, the chapter right before the chapter that opens up saying it was her, yeah, I don't like the reveal because it leads to a point where you're going, it could really be anyone, and they think it's Library Girl, so it's probably not gonna be, and this is gonna be amazing. It's gonna be such a twist that it's not Library Girl, and then it was Library Girl, so that was a bit of a letdown. But anyway, so Library Girl is discovered as the one, and Charlotte turns into the zombie and forces her to, confess that she did it and why and all that kind of stuff. And then she ends up getting the key, goes back to the hotel, and she's deciding whether or not to go through the door because, what's the names again? Nancy and Lorna are talking to her about why they stayed behind the detective agency rather than going through the door themselves. They pretty much know who killed them and they could go through the door, but they want to stay behind and help other people, work out who killed them and help them get through the door, which is fine, he said with a strained smile, which is fine, but I knew in that moment where the author was going and it upset me because I wanted to go through the door. Needless to say, this motivates Charlotte, who is umming and ahhing. Yes, she is, but I had the feeling, Charlotte's now going to stay true and she's going to become a detective as well. Had I known this was a series up front, which I did not know it till I'd read the book, I would have known that she would have stayed behind already anyway. I thought it was a standalone, so I thought she would go through the door. But she doesn't. Tess ends up taking her key and tries to go through the door, and here's where we have the issue. 27? Okay, I have to be quick. Here's where we have the issue that I spoke about in my reading vlog. I started off reading this on its own, and then I started reading the book and listening to it on Audible. Now, Tess takes her key, and she steals the key and wants to go through the door, and, who cares about Charlotte? I'm going to go through the door. Because apparently no one had been able to solve Tess's murder mystery. No one knows who killed her or why. And so she's convinced that she's going to be stuck at this hotel for the rest of her afterlife, I suppose. And so she says, no, this is my out. I'm going to take the key and I'm going to go through the door. This was the second climax that I absolutely loved because I did not expect this to happen at all. I really thought it was going to wrap up in a nice little bow and that Charlotte would either take the key and go through the door, or she would pocket the key or put it somewhere safe where no one can find it. But anyway, or just maybe no one wants to steal it, so just put it in her room because she has a room, and then just work at the detective agency. But no, Tess steals the key and tries to go through the door. Now, here's where we deviate. The book says she tried to go through the door, but as she went to turn the key, she sprang back from the door because almost like it burnt her or something, and she collapsed on the floor, and then she started crying and talking about why she tried to go through the door, and she was comforted by the other girls. The audiobook says she turned the key and she walked through the door and she was never seen again. So I honestly don't know which way it was meant to go, and I want to talk to the narrator of the Dead Girls Detective Agency on Audible and kind of say to her, look, I'm sorry, but how is it that your version and my version are so completely different at the end, but then there's a scene afterwards that's exactly the same? So the scene afterwards sets us up for the next book in the series, which you can imagine would be the case, where they're hearing a siren and Nancy comes over to, well, in the book, Tess is still there, and Charlotte is talking to Edison, and they're kind of figuring out that they like each other, which is fine. It's a romance side of it, and I don't really talk about that stuff, but it has been progressing throughout the book, so that's fine. Nancy runs over to them and says, "Oh, that sound means that we have another dead person coming in that we're going to have to help." So all of them, maybe even aside from Tess, because she's not mentioned, but anyway, she survived, but she's not mentioned. Letting her go. Nancy, Lorna, Charlotte, and Edison race off to go and meet this dead person and to go and help them, and that's kind of how it ends. They're running off to go and meet the new dead person. In the audio book on Audible, the same thing happens. Those four run off to go and meet the new dead person. However, in the book, Tess is still there. She just doesn't run with them. But in the audio version, Tess has gone through the door, and that's why she's not there, and that's why she's not mentioned. So I'm really confused about that. In the 2 minutes I have left, I'm going to quickly wrap up with my thoughts and feelings. Look, this book is a good book. It's certainly not my favorite book, but I don't hate this book. The ending confused the heck out of me, and had I known that the audio and the actual book were going to differentiate that much towards the end, I would not have listened to it, or I would not have listened to the last chapter on audiobook, because it was a mind F for quite a while after I finished going, hang on, which way did it actually go? And before realizing, well, Susie Cox wrote the book, so we have to go with the book version. Tess remained behind. Otherwise, it was good. The whole ghost system, magic system, whatever you want to call it, was really good. The narrative and the plot was really good, except for the fact when it deviated, but otherwise it was okay, and that's why I gave it 2 stars and not 3, 4, or 5 stars. If you have any comments, thoughts, and or questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment space below, and otherwise, I will see you at my next reading vlog, which will be at the end of this month, where I will wrap up this week, then do a monthly wrap-up, then do a seasonal wrap-up, and a seasonal DNF wrap-up. So much still to come your way at the end of this month, which is at the end of this coming week. Until then, letting you guys go with peace, blessings, and so much love. Mwah! I'll see you soon. Happy reading. Bye.